Hi, I'm Dustin Hoover with Legendary Trailer Repairs and one of BoatUS's trailer guys. We're here today to look at wheel bearings, how to replace them and what to look for if there's any damage involved. Some of the parts that we're going to look for inside the wheels are the double lip grease seals, the inner bearing, the inner race, the outer bearing, the outer race, the cotter pins, and the grease caps. Some of the tools we're going to use today are a standard hammer, a standard flathead screwdriver, a punch if necessary, channel lock pliers, and wire cutters for our cotter pin. The other tools are going to be a premium marine grease and an industrial bearing packer. This is going to make things easier. When considering where to jack the trailer up, you want to find a solid surface, not on the springs of the trailer and not on anything that could bend or give way once the weight of the trailer is on the jack. We also want to check to make sure that the tires on the other side are chocked and that the coupler is securely fastened to the vehicle and the emergency brake is on. If the tow vehicle is not available to latch to, make sure that your tongue jack is down and or the tongue of the trailer is firmly blocked so that it cannot fall while you're jacking the rear of the trailer. You must always make sure you secure the trailer on a jack stand. Don't rely on the jack to keep the trailer up when you're underneath of it. Now that we know our trailer is safely on the jack stands, the first thing we're going to check for is any play in the tire. Shaking the tire, we should feel just a small amount of play, which tells us that the adjustment of the bearings is okay. Secondly, we're going to spin the wheel to see if we hear anything. On this particular wheel, we do hear bearing damage. It could be rust, it could be the bearing starting to pit, but we're going to get inside and find out what exactly that noise is. The first thing we're going to do is remove the dust cap or bearing buddy. In this case, we have a bearing buddy. The outer sleeve is just a dust protector. Once the sleeve's off, using a standard hammer, we're going to tap the bearing buddy as we rotate the tire. This is going to start to dislodge the bearing buddy and allow it to come off. Once the bearing buddy is removed, we can inspect some of the grease to see if we see any kind of contaminants. Using standard paper towels so that we don't add any kind of oil products such as brake cleaner to the wheel bearings, we're going to simply wipe things off and see what they look like inside. We're now going to try to access the nut and the cotter pin that holds everything together. Simply wiping it off will allow you to see where the parts are and how to get to them. On this trailer, we do have a standard cotter pin that holds the nut and the bearings together. So using your wire cutters, you start to pry the bottom side of the cotter pin, and once it's loose, you can pry the cotter pin out by rotating it upwards and to the side. With the cotter pin removed, it's now time to take the axle nut off. Using a standard pair of channel locks, simply rotate the nut counterclockwise. If the axle's clean, the nut should come off with relatively easy pressure. Each part can be individually cleaned off and stored separately so that we know where all of our parts are before reinstallation. Next, we're going to try to jar the bearings loose, which is going to allow the outer bearing to come free and the axle washer. In our hands now, we have the axle washer and the outer bearing. We're first going to look very closely to see if there's any shavings in the grease. With no shavings found, we're going to continue to clean things off. With the outer bearing and the axle washer now in our hands, the first thing we're going to look for is any kind of metal shards that may indicate the bearing's starting to come apart. In this case, we don't see any, so we're going to continue to clean things and be able to visually inspect each bearing. Rubbing your paper towel across the rollers will expose the shiny metal, and in this case, we can see the damage in the bearing, which is apparent by rust marks and black pits in each bearing roller. Our next step after pulling the outer bearing is to pull the tire and hub. Once it's off, if you leave it upright, you'll be able to clean a lot of the grease out of it easier than letting it pour out onto the ground. This is going to make, again, the job cleaner in the long run. With most of the grease removed, we'll now see what the inner side of the hub looks like. Right off the bat, it's apparent that the seal is damaged. The amount of grease on the inside of the hub is also an indication that the seals have been wore out and should be replaced. In this application, because of the way we remove the seal and the price of the seals, there's no reason not to replace the seals each and every time you repack your wheel bearings. Using your channel locks once again, we're going to pry the seal out of the back side of the hub. A little bit of pressure will pop the seal right out. This is going to be discarded, and we're going to start fresh with a new seal when we reinstall everything. Now we have access to our inner bearing. Our inner bearing, just like our outer, is going to be carefully inspected for any kind of damage. Again, right off the bat, we can see that this bearing has lots of rust on it, which is going to cause vibration, heat, and finally failure of the bearing. We have the bearings removed from the hub now, but we're also going to look for some other things that could be an indication of bad bearings. One of them is the grease on the inside of the wheel. That shows us that grease seal was allowing the grease to get out. If the thick grease can get out, the thin water can get in. So a good indication of something to look for, even if you aren't actually doing the wheel bearings. Another thing we're going to find here on the actual spindle of the axle, we have a buildup of grease on the back side of the axle, and we have fishing line completely wrapped around this spindle. Fishing line, just like the propeller of a boat, can damage seals. This is all the kind of stuff that we want to look for and clean off so that we have a nice smooth surface for the bearings and the seals to ride. Now that we've determined that both bearings have damage, we want to get them out of the hub. We can't neglect the races though, because that's what the bearing rides on. The races are clearly seen inside the hub, which ride here on the outside. Looking at this particular race, because of the bearing, it's also damaged and has pits on it. So now it's time to get those races out. We're going to clean the excess grease out to allow our tools to work better for us. With the tire laying face down, the front of the hub is actually facing the ground. We're going to use a standard metal punch, always wearing safety glasses, and we're going to punch the outer race towards the ground. We work side to side to keep the race flat. Once the outer race is completely removed from the hub, we can see it here underneath. Again, closer inspection will reveal that it does have damage from the bearings. We're going to discard that and flip our tire over to now start to remove the inner race. Using the same process, our punch will be laid on the inside of the inner race and punched towards the ground. Working side to side, the race will slowly start to come out of the hub. Now that we have the hub completely clean of grease, bearings, and races, we'll start the install process. With the tire laying backside down to the ground, we're going to work on the outer race. The outer race can be put on the hub and started carefully with a hammer to keep the race square as it goes in. Then, using the proper race tool, we're going to drive the race down into the hub until it bottoms out. Oftentimes you can hear the difference in the sound once the race is all completely down. We'll flip the tire and be ready to install the inner race. The inner race is a little trickier because you can't start the race flat because of the outer surface of the hub. In this case, we have to be careful to try to drive the race in straight, again using our race drivers. Okay, that sound indicates that race is completely lodged in. We'll try one more time to clean the hub and remove any kind of shavings that the metal races against the metal hub may have created. At this point, we're ready to install the new bearings. We're going to use a Premium Plus multi-purpose grease. It is a NLGI grade number 2 grease that has great properties against high heat and saltwater washout. Now, filling the hub is easy enough to do, and if we overfill it, when we finally install the hub, it will push the excess grease out to us. For this particular wheel, this is a 1 1/16 bearing. This is actually our outer bearing that we're going to start to pack first. Placing it in the bearing packer, we're going to squeeze new grease into this bearing. If you were repacking an old bearing and the bearing were clean, this particular type of tool will push the old grease out and the new grease in. We're going to set our outer bearing aside now and go back to working on the inner bearing. Our inner bearing is now packed, and it's going to be placed in the hub with the smaller cone side down. We want to seat the bearing and just kind of clean the grease out around it. The next part we're going to install is a double lip grease seal. The importance of the double lip is one side can fight the bearing grease getting out, the other side can fight the water getting in. For all boat or marine applications, a double lip seal should be used. Placing the seal into the hub slightly on an angle, you'll actually start to impact the seal on the opposite higher side. Once the seal has started in the hub, you'll work in a circular motion to keep the seal flat and undamaged. We'll clean off any excess grease, which will also allow us to keep an eye on any new grease that may come out. The hub is now ready to put back onto the trailer spindle. The next step of the installation of the wheel bearings is going to be to put the hub back together. Before we do that, we have noticed one thing. Looking back at the spindle of the trailer axle, we noticed that it could use stainless steel collars. The collars are normally an aftermarket installation, which gives the seal a nice clean surface to ride on. This may be something we install on this trailer at a later time. You're going to pick up slightly on the wheel so not to damage the inner seal as the hub goes back on the spindle. Any excess grease can be removed from the hub and installed back into your bearing buddy or your dust cap. The hub's now ready for the installation of the outer bearing, which again will go cone or small side of the bearing to the inside, and try to firmly place it back into the back side of the hub. Next, we'll install our axle washer and our axle nut. Using our channel locks again, we'll start to tighten the axle nut until it is completely snug on the spindle. Once we have it all the way snug, then we'll do our adjustment to get the proper amount of relief on the bearings. Here we have no play in the axle whatsoever, which actually compresses the bearings and won't allow them to move inside the hub the way they need to. So knowing where the hole for the cotter pin is and the amount of adjustment notches we have on the nut, we're going to back it up one notch until we get to that hole. That's going to allow us just a very slight little bit of play in the wheel. And again, take the pressure off of those bearings. The next step is to reinstall a stainless steel cotter pin, in which we'll use our wire cutters to bend the ears of the cotter pin over. The excess of the cotter pin can be removed so that it doesn't interfere with your bearing buddy riding around them. Okay, with our cotter pin firmly in place, we're going to continue and fill the rest of our bearing buddy with additional grease, which again will be pushed out if the hub doesn't need it. Starting the bearing buddy on square, again we'll rotate the tire until the bearing buddy is fully pressed against the hub. The last step is that we're going to add a little bit of bearing grease to the outside of the bearing buddy. Filling that cavity will just help keep the water out and the exposed surfaces clean. After installing the external dust cap, the wheel is now done with the new bearings. We have just a very small bit of play in the tire and a nice sound and no longer hear the bad bearings in there. We're now done with the installation of this bearing. We're going to move to the other side. I'm Dustin Hoover. We'll see you in the BoatUS Trailering Magazine.